Both of today's stories are about people who made big choices that they thought would improve their lives, but neither of them really took the time to actually learn exactly what they were signing up for, and that led to disaster. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do and we upload several times every single week. So, if that's of interest to you, please gift the like button a nice brand new gumball machine, but don't tell them the gum is actually just painted balls of candle wax. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into our first story, which we call Dream Car. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning on June 8th, 2015, a 72-year-old man named James Lee Rogers pulled his gorgeous red sports car into the parking lot of a Waffle House in the town of Port Arthur, Texas. This was not just any ordinary vehicle. This was a pristine, top-of-the-line 2007 C6 Chevrolet Corvette. It was painted a brilliant, gleaming shade of victory red, and it practically glowed under the morning sun. For James, this car was the absolute realization of a lifelong dream. He had spent decades working hard in the local oil refineries, saving his money, and looking forward to the day when he could finally purchase a vehicle like this. It represented success, freedom, and a sense of pride that he had earned through years of diligent effort. Every single time he sat in the driver's seat, he felt an overwhelming wave of satisfaction. The car was incredibly modern for its time, featuring state-of-the-art electronics, push-button mechanisms, and a completely seamless design that omitted traditional physical door handles. To open the doors from either the inside or the outside, you simply had to press an electronic button, and a computerized actuator would release the latch. It felt futuristic, high-tech, and incredibly exclusive. James loved how the car handled on the open road, how the powerful engine purred, and how people would turn their heads to catch a glimpse of the sleek red machine as he drove past. James was a well-known and highly respected member of the local community in Port Arthur. He had spent his entire life in the area, growing up there, raising his family, and making countless friends along the way. He was a man of routine, and one of his absolute favorite daily rituals was visiting this specific Waffle House on State Highway 365. He did not just go there for the food or the coffee, although he did enjoy those things. He went there because it was a social hub where he could connect with his friends, chat with the friendly staff, and catch up on the local news. The waitresses knew exactly how he liked his coffee, and the other regulars always looked forward to his arrival. It was a warm, welcoming environment that felt like an extension of his own home. On this particular morning, James had brought along his beloved dog, a sweet and loyal little Lhasa Apso mix named Leia. Leia went almost everywhere with James, and she absolutely loved riding in the passenger seat of the Corvette. However, because animals were not allowed inside the restaurant due to health regulations, James knew he would have to leave Leia in the car for a brief period while he went inside to greet his friends and get his morning coffee. James pulled the Corvette into a parking spot directly in front of the building, though slightly offset from the main windows. He turned off the ignition, and the powerful engine died down to a quiet whisper. He looked over at Leia, who was sitting contentedly in the passenger seat, wagging her tail. James reached over and patted her head, telling her to be a good girl and promising that he would be back in just a couple of minutes. He knew the car was still cool inside from the air conditioning he had been running during the drive, and he did not plan on staying inside the restaurant for very long at all. He pushed the electronic button on the driver's side door, and with a soft click, the door popped open. He stepped out into the humid Texas air, closed the door behind him, and heard the automated lock system engage. He walked briskly toward the entrance of the Waffle House, looking forward to his morning routine. When James stepped inside the air-conditioned restaurant, the familiar smell of bacon, hash browns, and freshly brewed coffee washed over him. He scanned the room and immediately spotted his good friend, a man in his 60s named MJ, who was already sitting at his usual spot along the counter. MJ waved James over, and James gladly took the empty stool right next to him. The two men immediately fell into an easy, comfortable conversation talking about the weather forecast, how their respective families were doing, and various local events. The waitress arrived and poured James a piping hot cup of coffee without him even having to ask, greeting him with a warm smile. James smiled back and thanked her, feeling completely at ease in his favorite spot. As the minutes ticked by, more regulars began to filter into the restaurant, and James made a point to greet each of them, sharing laughs and exchanging friendly banter. The atmosphere was so pleasant and engaging that James completely lost track of how quickly the time was passing. He decided that since he was having such a great time, he might as well order some breakfast. He flagged down the waitress and ordered a plate of food, fully intending to eat quickly and then head back out to his car. However, almost immediately after placing his food order, James happened to look out the window toward the parking lot. Although his Corvette was parked slightly out of his direct line of sight from the counter, he could see the brilliant, intense sunlight beating down on the asphalt outside. The pavement was practically shimmering with heat, and James realized with a sudden jolt of concern that the temperature outside was rising incredibly fast. June in Port Arthur, Texas, is notoriously hot and humid, and even though the car had been cool when he left it, the intense sun would quickly turn the interior of the vehicle into a greenhouse. He started to feel a wave of guilt and anxiety about leaving Leia out there, even if it had only been for a short while. He knew that dogs cannot handle extreme heat, and he did not want her to suffer or get dehydrated. He turned to MJ and told him that he was going to run outside for just a minute to check on his dog and make sure she was doing okay. MJ, who was busy talking to another customer nearby, nodded and promised to keep an eye on James's seat and his coffee until he returned. James got up from the counter, walked out of the main dining area, and exited through the front doors of the Waffle House. As soon as he stepped outside, the heavy, stifling heat of the Texas morning hit him like a physical wall. He walked around the corner of the building to where his beautiful red Corvette was parked. As he approached the vehicle, he looked through the window and saw Leia sitting on the seat. She was panting slightly, but she looked up and wagged her tail excitedly when she saw her owner approaching. James smiled, feeling relieved that she was okay, but he knew he needed to make a decision. He decided to climb into the driver's seat to personally assess the temperature inside the car. He pressed the electronic button on the exterior door handle, the door clicked open, and he slid into the comfortable leather seat, closing the door behind him to keep whatever cool air was left inside the cabin. He reached over and stroked Leia's back, speaking to her in a soothing voice. Almost immediately, James realized that the air inside the Corvette was far warmer than he had anticipated. The sun was beating directly down through the windshield, and the heat was radiating off the dashboard and the leather seats. It was clear to James that he could not leave Leia in the car while he went back inside to eat his breakfast. It was simply too hot, and it was going to get dangerous very quickly. He decided that he would go back into the Waffle House, quickly cancel his food order, pay for his coffee, and then immediately head home where both he and his dog could relax in the safety of their air-conditioned house. It was the only responsible thing to do. He reached for the electronic door release button on the driver's side door panel and pressed it, expecting to hear the familiar click of the door latch releasing, but absolutely nothing happened. James frowned, slightly confused. He pressed the button again, pushing it firmly with his thumb. Still, there was no sound and the door remained firmly shut. He tried a third time, pressing and holding the button, but the door did not budge. He looked at the control panel, wondering if perhaps there was some kind of temporary glitch with the driver's side button. He leaned across the center console, stretching over to the passenger side door, and pressed the electronic release button on that side. Again, there was absolute silence. The passenger door remained tightly sealed. At this point, James felt a small prickle of unease. He realized that the electrical system in the car might be having an issue, so he decided the best course of action would be to simply start the engine. If he could turn the car on, the alternator would provide power to the electrical systems, and he would also be able to blast the air conditioning to cool down the rapidly heating cabin. He pressed his foot down on the brake pedal and pushed the engine start button on the dashboard. The car remained completely dead. The dashboard displays did not light up. The engine did not make a single sound. There was no clicking, no whirring, and no electronic hum. The entire vehicle was completely devoid of electrical power. The battery had apparently suffered a sudden and total failure, draining completely while the car was parked in the lot. Because the C6 Corvette relied entirely on electrical power to operate its electronic door latches, the loss of power meant that the doors were effectively locked shut. There were no traditional mechanical pull levers or handles on the door panels to open them. Unlike older cars that had a physical steel rod connecting the interior handle to the latch mechanism, this high-tech sports car relied on electronic solenoids. If the battery was dead, the circuit was dead, and the physical latch remained locked in place. James was completely trapped. He sat back in the seat, his heart beginning to beat faster. He tried to stay calm, telling himself that there had to be a simple solution. He looked around the cabin, searching for any kind of obvious manual override, but his eyes found nothing but smooth leather, plastic panels, and electronic switches. The windows were fully rolled up, and because they were also electronically operated, there was no way to roll them down. The interior of the car was already becoming noticeably hotter by the second. The sun was continuing to rise, and the glass windows were acting like magnifying glasses, trapping the heat inside the small, insulated cabin. James was starting to sweat heavily, and he could hear Leia's panting becoming faster and more shallow. He knew he needed to get out of the car immediately. He reached for his pockets, searching for his cell phone so he could call MJ inside the Waffle House or call for emergency assistance. But as his hand searched his pockets, he felt nothing but empty fabric. With a sickening feeling in his stomach, James remembered that before he had walked out of the restaurant, he had noticed his phone battery was extremely low. Because he was a regular and knew the staff well, he had handed his phone to one of the waitresses to plug into a charger behind the counter while he sat and chatted. His phone was sitting safely inside the air-conditioned restaurant, completely out of his reach. He had no way to call for help. Just then, James looked out the front windshield and saw a man and a woman walking out of the Waffle House. They were heading toward their own car, which was parked just a few spaces away from his Corvette. James felt a massive surge of relief. He immediately began waving his arms frantically, hitting his hands against the windshield and shouting at the top of his lungs. He wanted them to look over, see his distress, and come help him. But the windows of the Corvette were thick, high-quality safety glass, designed to insulate the cabin from outside noise. To the couple walking across the sunny parking lot, the car appeared completely silent. Furthermore, the bright morning sun was reflecting directly off the sloped windshield of the Corvette, creating a harsh, blinding glare. From the outside, the interior of the car was practically invisible, shrouded in dark reflections. The couple climbed into their vehicle, started the engine, and backed out of their parking space. Desperate to stop them, James slammed his hand onto the center of the steering wheel to honk the horn, hoping the loud noise would force them to look in his direction. But because the car's electrical battery was completely dead, the horn did not make a single sound. He watched in absolute horror as the couple's car drove out of the parking lot and disappeared down the road. Now, James was truly starting to panic. The heat inside the car was becoming almost unbearable. The air felt thick and heavy, making it difficult to draw a full breath. Sweat was pouring down his face, stinging his eyes and soaking through his shirt. Leia was now lying on the passenger seat, panting heavily and looking at him with wide, frightened eyes. James knew that a car parked in the direct sun on a hot summer day could reach temperatures of over 130 degrees in a matter of minutes. He was trapped in a metal and glass oven, and time was rapidly running out. He began to scream for help, pounding his fists against the side windows as hard as he could. He shouted until his throat was raw, but there was no one nearby to hear him. The parking lot in that specific area was relatively quiet, and the few people who did walk by were focused on getting into the air-conditioned restaurant as quickly as possible. None of them looked toward the red sports car, and even if they had, the glare on the glass prevented them from seeing the elderly man and his dog fighting for their lives inside. Realizing that screaming was only wasting his energy and making him hotter, James forced himself to stop. He needed to find a physical way to break out of the car. He remembered that he kept a small emergency toolkit in the cargo area behind the seats. He scrambled over the center console, ignoring the painful heat radiating from the leather, and reached into the back of the car. He grabbed the small zipper bag and dragged it into the front seat. He opened it up, hoping to find a heavy tool like a hammer or a crowbar that he could use to smash one of the windows. But when he opened the bag, his hope quickly faded. The toolkit was very basic, containing only a few simple items. There was a pair of thin pliers, some jumper cables, and a small plastic flashlight. There was nothing heavy enough to easily break the thick safety glass of a Corvette window. Still, James refused to give up. He took the pliers and tried to wedge the metal nose into the thin gap between the window glass and the door frame, hoping he could somehow lever the window down or force the mechanism to yield. But the window glass was tightly sealed and incredibly strong. The pliers slipped repeatedly, scratching the glass but doing absolutely no damage to the window itself. James's breath was coming in short, ragged gasps. The temperature inside the cabin had likely climbed past 120 degrees, and the air was running out of oxygen. He felt incredibly dizzy, and his muscles were beginning to ache from the extreme heat and exertion. He looked at Leia, who was now barely moving, her tongue hanging out as she struggled to breathe. The sight of his beloved dog suffering gave James a sudden, desperate burst of adrenaline. He reclined the driver's seat back as far as it would go. He positioned himself so that he could bring his feet up, and he began to kick the windshield with all the strength he had left. He slammed his heavy shoes against the glass over and over again, hoping to shatter it or at least pop it out of its frame. But car windshields are made of laminated safety glass, designed specifically to withstand massive impacts without shattering or breaking away. To James, it felt like he was kicking a solid concrete wall. His legs grew tired and his knees ached, but the glass remained completely intact, without even a single crack. Exhausted and trembling, James sat back up and grabbed the pliers once more. He began to swing them like a hammer, smashing the metal head against the side window of the driver's door. The side windows are made of tempered glass, which is incredibly strong on its flat surface. James struck the window repeatedly, but the pliers simply bounced off the glass, leaving nothing but minor scuffs. His energy was completely spent. The adrenaline rush subsided, leaving him feeling incredibly weak, nauseous, and disoriented. He dropped the pliers onto the floorboard, unable to hold them any longer. He slumped back into the seat, feeling the oppressive, suffocating heat pressing down on his chest. His vision was starting to tunnel, and he could feel his consciousness slipping away. In a final, desperate attempt to find a solution, he reached forward and opened the glove compartment in front of the passenger seat. Inside, he found the thick, black leather pouch containing the vehicle's owner's manual. James pulled the manual out, his hands shaking so violently that he could barely hold it. He opened the book, hoping against hope that there would be a clearly marked emergency section that would tell him how to open the doors without power. But his mind was fogged by the extreme heat, and his eyes were struggling to focus on the small, dense print. The manual was hundreds of pages long, filled with complex diagrams and technical jargon about the car's advanced systems. He flipped through the pages frantically, but the words seemed to dance and blur together. He could not find the information he needed. The effort of holding the book and turning the pages became too much for his weakened body. The manual slipped from his fingers and fell onto the floor, open to a random page. James closed his eyes, his breathing slowing down. He could no longer feel the heat, only a deep, overwhelming exhaustion. He reached out his hand and rested it on Leia, who had also gone completely still. Meanwhile, inside the Waffle House, MJ was enjoying his breakfast. He had been chatting with some other locals, and because the restaurant was busy and lively, he had not realized how much time had actually passed. He assumed James had run out to his car, decided to head home because of the heat, and simply forgotten to come back inside to say goodbye. It was a reasonable assumption, and since James was a regular, MJ did not think much of it. He finished his meal, paid his bill, and spent some more time talking with the staff. It was not until nearly noon, almost 4 hours after James had walked out of the restaurant, that 2 employees of the Waffle House happened to walk past the red Corvette in the parking lot. One of the employees looked through the window and noticed James slumped over in the driver's seat. They initially thought he was just taking a nap, but when they knocked on the glass, James did not move. They tried to open the doors, but they were locked tight. Looking closer, they saw that James's skin was extremely flushed and wet with sweat, and he was completely unresponsive. They realized with a shock of horror that something was terribly wrong. They ran back inside the restaurant, shouting that James was trapped in his car and appeared to be unconscious. MJ, hearing this, felt his stomach drop. He looked at his watch and realized with a wave of immense guilt that James had been gone for 4 hours. He ran outside with the employees and several other customers. They gathered around the Corvette, banging on the windows and trying to pry the doors open, but the high-tech car remained locked tight. MJ immediately pulled out his phone and called 911. Emergency services arrived quickly, and firefighters had to use specialized tools to break the tempered glass of the passenger side window. When they finally opened the doors, they were hit by a wave of heat that felt like opening a hot oven. Unfortunately, it was far too late. Both James Lee Rogers and his dog, Leia, had already passed away from extreme heat exhaustion. The tragedy shocked the community of Port Arthur, and James's family was left completely devastated. They could not understand how a healthy man could get trapped inside his own vehicle and die in a public parking lot just yards away from help. It was only during the subsequent investigation that the cruel irony of the situation was revealed. James had been incredibly proud of his high-tech sports car, but he had never learned about a vital safety feature that was built into the vehicle for this exact scenario. It turned out that Chevrolet was fully aware that an electrical failure could trap occupants inside the Corvette. Because of this, they had installed a manual mechanical release lever on the floor of the vehicle, directly next to the driver's seat. The lever was simple to operate. All a driver had to do was pull it upward, and a mechanical cable would physically release the door latch, allowing the door to open easily without any electrical power whatsoever. There was a corresponding lever on the passenger side floor as well, however, because the lever was located flat against the floorboard, partially obscured by the seat adjustment controls in the carpet, it was not easily visible to someone who did not know it was there. The instructions for this manual release lever were indeed located in the owner's manual that James had desperately tried to read, but they were buried on page 80 of the dense, highly technical document. In his state of extreme panic and physical decline from the rapid heat onset, James had been unable to find it. In 2018, James's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against General Motors, the parent company of Chevrolet, arguing that the electronic door design was inherently defective and presented a severe safety hazard to drivers who might not be aware of the hidden manual release. The lawsuit was eventually dismissed, with the manufacturer maintaining that the vehicle was equipped with the necessary safety overrides and that the information was clearly provided in the owner's manual. While Chevrolet continued to manufacture Corvettes with electronic doors, they did make changes to subsequent models, placing the manual release overrides in more prominent positions and placing the corresponding safety instructions much closer to the very front of the owner's manuals so that such a tragic mistake would never happen again. But for James Lee Rogers, a man who had finally achieved his lifelong dream of owning his ultimate car, that dream had ultimately turned into a silent, inescapable trap. Now, we are going to transition to our second story, which takes us back in time over 150 years to a very different kind of environment, but one that involves a young man who also made a split-second decision to find safety, only to realize too late that he did not fully understand what he was getting himself into. On the morning of August 20th, 1862, a 17-year-old French immigrant named Jean Larue was hard at work on a farm in Ottawa Township, Minnesota. Jean was a young man of slender build with a gentle disposition and a deep, quiet work ethic. He had left his home country of France just a couple of years prior, driven by the promise of adventure and economic opportunity in the rapidly expanding United States of America. He had ended up in Minnesota, working as a hired farmhand for a prominent local landowner named Edward Gleek. For Jean, life on the American frontier was vastly different from anything he had ever known in France. The work was physically demanding and practically endless. From sunrise to sunset, Jean was responsible for a wide array of chores, including clearing brush, tending to the livestock, planting and harvesting crops, and splitting massive piles of firewood to keep the farmhouse warm during the harsh Minnesota winters. But despite the relentless physical labor, Jean never complained. He was focused on a single, deeply personal goal. He wanted to save every single penny he earned so that he could eventually return to France, buy a beautiful home, and support his beloved mother, whom he missed more than words could describe. Because Jean was so far from home and did not speak English perfectly, he often felt incredibly isolated and homesick. To cope with his loneliness, he kept a detailed personal journal. He carried this small paper notebook with him everywhere, and whenever he had a rare moment of free time, he would walk into the dense, beautiful woods that bordered the farm. There was one specific tree that Jean was drawn to, a massive ancient oak tree that stood deep in the forest. The oak tree was incredibly wide, with sweeping branches that created a peaceful, shaded canopy. At some point in its long life, the tree had been struck by lightning or suffered some internal rot, leaving a large, hollow cavity within its trunk. Jean loved to sit at the base of this magnificent tree, using his pocket knife to carve small marks into the bark and writing long, detailed entries in his journal. He wrote about his daily life, his dreams for the future, and how much he looked forward to the day he would finally see his mother again. He also kept his life savings, a collection of paper bills and gold coins, wrapped securely inside a small cloth pouch, which he kept tucked inside his leather satchel along with his journal. On this particular morning, Jean was standing near the farm's large wooden barn, holding a heavy iron-splitting axe. He had a large pile of oak logs that needed to be split into firewood before the afternoon. The air was warm and humid, and Jean was already sweating as he swung the axe, clean cuts, splitting the logs in half. He enjoyed the rhythmic, meditative nature of the work, as it allowed his mind to wander and escape the harsh realities of his current situation. However, the peaceful atmosphere of the morning was suddenly shattered. While Jean was lifting his axe for another swing, a loud, booming sound echoed through the trees from the direction of the nearby Minnesota River. Jean froze, holding the axe in midair. He listened intently, his heart starting to thump against his ribs. A second later, another boom sounded, followed by a rapid, chaotic succession of sharp cracks and distant shouting. Jean knew exactly what those sounds were. They were gunshots. And they were close. At that moment, a wave of sheer terror washed over the young farmhand. For the past several weeks, a dark cloud of fear had been hanging over the entire region. The local indigenous population, the Sioux tribe, had been growing increasingly desperate and angry. Over the previous decade, thousands of white settlers had flooded into the Minnesota River Valley, taking over the tribe's ancestral hunting grounds, displacing them from their homes, and failing to provide the food and government provisions that had been promised in land treaties. The Sioux were starving, and their pleas for help had been completely ignored by the government authorities. Just 2 days earlier, on August 18th, the tensions had finally boiled over. The Sioux had launched a massive, coordinated uprising along the river, attacking settlements, burning farms to the ground, and killing hundreds of settlers in an attempt to reclaim their land. The news of the violence had spread like wildfire through the territory, and the residents of Ottawa Township had been living in a state of constant, paralyzing anxiety, knowing that the conflict could reach their doorsteps at any moment. Hearing the sudden barrage of gunfire, Jean was absolutely convinced that the Sioux warriors had arrived in Ottawa Township and were currently attacking the neighboring farms. He knew that as a young man, he would be a prime target. He also knew that he did not have the training or the resources to fight off an attacking force. He had to run, and he had to do it immediately. Jean dropped his heavy splitting axe onto the grass and sprinted toward the farmhouse. He ran inside to the small room where he slept, his hands shaking as he gathered his most precious belongings. He grabbed his hunting rifle and a small pouch of ammunition. He reached under his mattress and pulled out his leather satchel, which contained his personal journal and his entire life savings. He slung the satchel over his shoulder, grabbed his rifle, and ran back out the door, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of smoke or approaching riders. Instead of running toward the town center, where he feared he might be cornered or caught in the crossfire, Jean decided to head directly into the dense forest bordering the farm. He knew the woods incredibly well from his frequent walks, and he believed the thick underbrush and towering trees would provide him with the perfect cover to hide from any potential attackers. He sprinted past the barn and plunged into the safety of the tree line, his boots kicking up dirt and leaves as he ran deeper into the shadows of the forest. After running for what felt like miles, Jean's lungs were burning and his legs were shaking from exhaustion. He stopped behind a thick pine tree, pressing his back against the rough bark as he struggled to catch his breath. He He held his rifle tightly against his chest, listening intently for any sounds of pursuit. The forest around him was eerily quiet, save for the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of leaves in the wind. The distant gunfire had stopped, but Jean was still consumed by panic. He knew that if he stayed in the open forest, he was still vulnerable. He needed a place where he could hide securely, somewhere where no one would ever think to look for him. Suddenly, he remembered his favorite spot. The giant, hollow oak tree. The tree was located in a secluded hollow, surrounded by thick brush that made it difficult to see from a distance. Jean knew that the hollow cavity inside the trunk was large enough to fit a person. He realized that if he could climb inside the tree, he would be completely shielded from view. He could wait out the attack in safety and then emerge once the danger had passed. Jean quickly made his way through the brush until he reached the ancient oak. He looked up at the large opening in the side of the trunk, which was located about 5 feet off the ground. The opening was somewhat narrow, but Jean was confident that his slim frame would allow him to squeeze through. He unslung his leather satchel and carefully pushed it through the opening into the dark interior of the tree, hearing it land softly at the bottom of the hollow trunk. Next, he carefully pushed his rifle through the opening, letting it slide down inside. Finally, Jean grabbed onto the rough bark of the tree, pulled his feet up, and began to wiggle his way backward through the narrow opening. It was a tight fit and the rough wood scraped against his clothes and skin, but with a firm push, he managed to slide his hips through the gap. He let his body slip downward into the hollow center of the trunk, expecting to slide easily to the bottom and stand comfortably inside. But as soon as his feet touched the bottom of the cavity, Jean realized he had made a terrible mistake. The interior of the hollow trunk was much narrower than he had estimated. As his body slid completely inside, his shoulders and arms were pressed tightly against the rough, decaying wood of the inner walls. The cavity tapered downward, becoming narrower near the base of the tree. Jean's arms were pinned flat against his sides and his legs were compressed together. He was wedged tightly inside the dark, confined space, unable to move his limbs more than a fraction of an inch. At first, Jean did not panic. He figured he could simply push himself back up and climb out the way he had come. He tried to bend his knees to get some leverage, but there was simply no room to bend them. He tried to wiggle his shoulders and use his elbows to pull himself upward, but the rough, uneven surface of the internal wood caught on his wool clothing, locking him in place like a one-way latch. Every time he tried to wriggle upward, he only succeeded in slipping slightly further down into the narrowing funnel of the trunk. Jean was completely stuck. The air inside the tree was cool, damp, and smelled strongly of rotting wood and earth. It was pitch black, with the only source of light being the small opening high above his head, which now seemed impossibly far away. Jean began to breathe rapidly, his chest pressing painfully against the hardwood walls with every inhalation. He realized with a growing sense of dread that he was completely helpless. He could not reach his rifle, which was wedged somewhere near his feet, and he could not reach his satchel. He began to scream for help. He yelled at the top of his lungs, hoping that his boss, Edward Gleek, or one of the other farmhands would hear him. He screamed until his voice cracked, but the thick, solid wood of the ancient oak tree absorbed the sound, muffling his cries so that they barely carried beyond the immediate brush. Deep in the secluded forest, there was no one to hear him. While Jean was trapped in the darkness of the oak tree, Edward Gleek was heading toward the center of Ottawa Township. Edward had also heard the distant gunshots that morning, and like everyone else, he had been deeply concerned. He had walked out of his barn just in time to see his young farmhand, Jean, running toward the woods with his rifle and satchel. Edward had not tried to stop him. He understood the kid was terrified, and he could not blame him for seeking shelter. However, when Edward arrived in the town center, he did not find a scene of bloody battle. Instead, he found a crowd of confused and anxious residents gathered around a local official. The official was explaining that there was no Sioux attack in Ottawa Township. The gunshots that had caused such widespread panic had actually been fired by a group of rowdy American soldiers who were traveling up the Minnesota River on a steamboat. The soldiers, perhaps fueled by alcohol or simple excitement, had decided to fire their rifles repeatedly into the air as they passed the town, completely unaware of the absolute terror they were causing to the settlers on the shore. The relief in the town was palpable, though many residents were furious at the soldiers' incredibly irresponsible behavior. Edward Gleek sighed with relief and turned to head back to his farm. He figured he would find Jean back at work, perhaps a bit embarrassed about running away but safe and sound, but when Edward returned to the farm, Jean was nowhere to be found. Edward walked out to the woodpile, but the splitting axe was still lying on the grass where Jean had dropped it. He went into the farmhouse, but Jean's room was empty and his belongings were gone. Edward walked to the edge of the woods and called out Jean's name several times, but there was no response. Edward waited throughout the afternoon, expecting Jean to return once he realized the shooting had stopped. But as the sun began to set and darkness fell over the farm, there was still no sign of the young Frenchman. The next morning came and went, and still, Jean did not return. Edward searched the immediate forest around the farm, but he did not know about the secret hollow oak tree where Jean loved to spend his time. After a few weeks of searching and asking around the township, Edward finally came to a logical conclusion. He knew how incredibly homesick Jean had been and how much he had longed to return to his mother in France. Edward assumed that the sheer terror of the false alarm had been the final straw for the young man. He figured Jean had simply kept running, made his way to a larger city, and used his savings to board a ship back to Europe without looking back. It was a common occurrence on the frontier, and Edward eventually hired a new farmhand and moved on with his life. The decades rolled past. The American Civil War ended, the frontier was settled, and Ottawa Township grew into a peaceful, modern farming community. Edward Gleek grew old, his hair turning white and his body slowing down, but he continued to live on the same farm, looking out over the fields he had worked for his entire life. 57 years later, in July of 1919, Edward Gleek was sitting on his front porch. He was now an elderly man, unable to perform the heavy physical labor required to run the farm. He relied on hired crews to maintain the property, and on this particular morning, a group of local lumber workers was busy clearing out a section of the old forest bordering the farm, removing dead and dying trees to make room for new pasture land. As Edward sat enjoying the warm summer breeze, he saw one of the workers run out of the tree line. The man was running frantically, his face pale and his eyes wide with shock. He sprinted up to the porch, gasping for air, and told Edward that he needed to come into the woods immediately because they had found something incredible and deeply disturbing. Intrigued and slightly concerned, Edward slowly stood up, grabbed his walking cane, and followed the worker into the cool shade of the forest. They walked deep into the woods, following a path that Edward had not traveled in decades, until they reached a small, secluded hollow. There, a group of workers was standing in a silent, solemn circle around a massive, ancient oak tree that had been cut down. The tree was incredibly wide, and as it had fallen, the trunk had split open along a natural seam, revealing a large hollow cavity inside. The workers stood back, allowing Edward to approach the split trunk. Edward leaned forward, squinting his eyes in the dim light of the forest. At first, he could not make out what was inside the hollow tree. He saw a rusted metal object that looked like the barrel of an old rifle. Next to it was a deteriorated leather bag, its straps rotted away, but then Edward's eyes traveled upward and his heart stopped. Nestled tightly inside the narrowest part of the hollow trunk was a mummified human form. The dry, sap-rich environment inside the sealed oak tree had perfectly preserved the body, preventing it from decaying in the normal way. The features were incredibly distinct. It was the body of a young man, his arms still pinned tightly to his sides, his head tilted slightly upward toward the opening that had once been his only view of the outside world. Edward felt a wave of dizzying shock wash over him. He recognized the shape of the jaw, the remnants of the wool clothing, and the unmistakable leather satchel. It was Jean Leroux. With trembling hands, one of the workers carefully reached into the tree and retrieved the leather satchel, which had been protected from the elements for over half a century. Inside, the paper journal was remarkably well preserved. Edward opened the weathered pages and began to read the elegant French handwriting. The journal entries detailed Jean's daily life on the farm, his love for his mother, and his dreams of returning home. But the final entry, written in a shaky, barely legible scrawl, told the true, horrifying story of what had happened on that August morning 57 years earlier. Jean had written that he had climbed into the tree to hide from the Sioux, believing the gunshots meant the farm was being attacked. He explained that he had slid down into the hollow trunk and immediately become hopelessly trapped. He had screamed for help for hours, but no one had come. Realizing that he was going to die in the darkness, Jean had somehow managed to use his fingers to write one last message in his journal, using the tiny bit of light filtering through the opening above him. In his final message, Jean pleaded with whoever found his body to take the money from his satchel and send it to his mother in France, so that his years of hard work would not be in vain. He wrote that he was cold, that he was sorry he would never see her again, and that he hoped she would forgive him. Edward Gleek stood in the quiet forest, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, as he looked at the remains of the young man he had assumed had abandoned him so long ago. Jean had not run away to France. He had been right there, just a short distance from the farmhouse, trapped in a living coffin while the world went on without him. Edward made sure that Jean's final wishes were carried out. Although his mother had sadly passed away in the decades since his disappearance, the money was sent to his surviving family members in France, along with a journal that detailed his final tragic days. Jean's remains were finally removed from the ancient oak and given a proper, respectful burial in a local cemetery, bringing a somber end to a mystery that had lasted for nearly 60 years. Both James Lee Rogers and Jean Leroux were men who made quick, decisive choices in moments of perceived danger, believing they were doing the right thing to protect themselves and those they loved. But because they did not fully understand the hidden traps that lay within their choices, Their desperate bids for safety ultimately led them into silent, inescapable prisons. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya!